The oil lamps flickered like dying stars in Finch's palace, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the saloon's smoke-stained walls. The air reeked of stale whiskey, unwashed bodies, and something else, the metallic scent of fear that clung to the 5 women bound together on the makeshift stage like livestock at market. Ruth Kellerman, 19, pressed her trembling fingers against the rope burns on her wrists, her mind racing with fragments of explosives knowledge her late father had taught her, knowledge that might be her only salvation. The youngest among them, she had watched her family die in a mining accident that wasn't quite an accident, and now she understood the same forces that had killed them were about to destroy her. Isabel Valdez fought to keep her dancer's posture straight, despite the humiliation burning through her veins. At 24, she had once commanded standing ovations in San Antonio's finest theaters, until a jealous wife had her beaten and scarred. Now, feeling the hungry stares of drunken miners, she channeled that familiar rage into steel, resolve, her dark eyes blazing with unbroken defiance. Callie Morrison, 21, bit down hard on her lower lip to stop its trembling tasting blood as memories flooded back her own father's signature on the papers that sold her to settle gambling debts. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound, but it had also taught her that survival meant trusting no one, relying only on herself. Joanne Bradford stood with military bearing despite her bonds, her 30-year-old frame still carrying the discipline of a Union Army nurse. Behind her composed exterior guilt gnawed at her conscience. She had once provided medical aid to a corrupt territorial official in exchange for safe passage, a compromise that had saved her life, but cost her soul. Now she calculated escape routes with the same precision she had once used to save wounded soldiers. Naomi Chen, 26, kept her head down, her long black hair hiding the small piece of charcoal clutched in her palm. The daughter of Chinese immigrants, she had learned early that survival sometimes required silence, but her mind remained sharp as a blade. With careful movements, she began scratching a single word on the wooden stage: resist. No, gentlemen. Saul Finch's voice boomed over the raucous crowd, his gold teeth glinting in the lamplight like a predator's fangs. Tonight, we have prime merchandise, each one guaranteed to fulfill whatever domestic duties you require. The crowd roared its approval, and Ruth's fingers instinctively moved to her boot, where she had hidden a small vial of black powder, a habit from her demolition days that might prove useful tonight. A bearded miner lurched forward, grabbing Isabel's chin with tobacco-stained fingers. "This one's got spirit. I'll break that soon enough. $200. Isabel jerked her head away, her voice cutting through the noise. "Touch me again, and lose that hand, pendejo." "Feisty," another voice called. "I like them with fight in 'em, $250. That's when the saloon doors exploded inward with such force they splintered against the walls. Sam Crowe stepped into the chaos like vengeance incarnate, his weathered face bearing scars that spoke of countless battles won and lost. His dark eyes swept the room with predatory intensity, and his hand rested with casual familiarity on the grip of his Colt .45. At 35, he moved with the fluid grace of a man comfortable with violence. But something deeper burned in his expression, a haunted look that spoke of failures that never healed. "Evening, gentlemen." Sam's voice carried the quiet authority of rolling thunder. "Seems you're having quite a party." The crowd instinctively backed away as he strode through the room, his presence commanding respect, born of reputation and fear. On the stage, 5 pairs of eyes fixed on this unexpected arrival, with desperate hope tempered by hard-won cynicism. Ruth felt her heartbeat quicken as she studied the stranger's face, noting the set of his jaw, and the careful way he held himself like her father had when preparing to handle dangerous explosives. Isabel recognized something in Sam's bearing that she had rarely seen in men: respect for the dangerous rather than desire to possess it. Callie's rancher instincts read the newcomer like weather patterns, sensing both strength and vulnerability in his stance. Joanne's military training cataloged potential ally versus threat, and everything about Sam Crowe suggested the former. Naomi scratched another word beneath the first: hope. Saul Finch's smile never wavered, but his eyes narrowed as he studied this unwelcome guest. A heavy-set man with the soft flesh of prosperity built on others' suffering, Finch had not reached his position by backing down from challenges. Yet something about Sam Crowe made his hand inch toward the derringer hidden in his vest. "Samuel Crowe," Finch said with forced joviality. "What brings you to my establishment? If you're here to bid the price, just reach 300 for the dark-haired beauty." Sam's gaze shifted to the women on the stage, and for a moment, his composed mask slipped. Ruth saw pain flicker across his features, the look of a man haunted by someone he had failed to save. "I'm not here to bid," Sam replied, pulling a leather pouch from his coat and tossing it onto the nearest table. Silver coins spilled out, catching the lamplight like captured stars. "I'm here to buy them all." The saloon fell silent, except for the soft hiss of the oil lamps and the distant sound of wind rattling the windows. The pouch contained more money than most of these men saw in a lifetime. "Now, Sam," Finch's voice took on a harder edge. "These ladies have contractual obligations, legal debts that must be honored according to territorial law." "What law?" Sam's hand moved closer to his weapon, the kind written on blank paper with forged signatures. Naomi's head snapped up, her eyes widening. How could he know about the blank contracts she had seen in Finch's office? Finch's composure cracked slightly. "I don't know what you're implying, but I'm not implying anything." Sam's voice cut through the smoke and tension like a blade. "I'm stating facts. Those women walk out of here tonight free and clear, or we settle this the way men settled things before lawyers got involved." On the stage, Ruth felt the small vial of black powder in her boot and made a desperate decision. If this stranger was willing to fight for them, she would give him every advantage possible. "You're outnumbered, Crowe," Finch warned, gesturing to the armed men positioned throughout the saloon. "And this is my town. I'd hate for there to be any unpleasantness." Sam smiled then, and it was the expression of a wolf that had chosen its prey. "Saul, I've been killing men since I was 16. Apaches, outlaws, soldiers who thought they were tougher than they were. You really think a handful of drunken miners worry me?" The tension ratcheted higher as hands moved toward weapons throughout the room. The 5 women pressed closer together, sensing that violence was about to erupt around them like a summer thunderstorm. Ruth caught Isabel's eye and mouthed a single word: "Powder." Isabel's eyebrows rose, but she nodded slightly, understanding that the youngest among them might have a plan. That's when Sam made his move. In one fluid motion, he drew his Colt and aimed it directly at Finch's forehead. "Last chance, Saul. Take the silver and let them go, or we find out how fast your boys really are." The saloon erupted into chaos. Finch's men went for their guns, but Sam was already moving. His first shot shattered a whiskey bottle inches from the nearest gunman's hand, sending glass shards flying and amber liquids splashing across the floor. The message was clear: he could have killed the man, but chose mercy. "Next one goes between your eyes." Sam roared over the confusion. "Anyone who wants to see tomorrow backs away from those women." On the stage, Isabel attacked the ropes with her fingernails, while Ruth worked frantically to free the small vial from her boot. "Help me with these knots," Isabel hissed. Callie and Joanne immediately joined the effort, their hands shaking as they fought against the hemp bonds. Naomi grabbed her piece of charcoal and began scrawling frantically on the stage floor: "Back door, kitchen." A rifle cracked from the rear of the saloon, and splinters exploded from the stage near Ruth's feet. She stumbled but kept working on the vial, finally freeing it, as blood seeped from a wood fragment that had grazed her arm. "Get down!" Sam dove behind an overturned table as more shots filled the air. The acrid smell of gunpowder began mixing with whiskey and tobacco smoke. Naomi threw herself across Ruth and Callie, shielding them from flying bullets, while Joanne used her military training to assess their tactical situation. 5 women, minimal cover, multiple armed hostiles, not good odds. Sam rolled right and came up firing. His second shot extinguished the lamp nearest the stage, plunging that section into protective darkness. His third shot punched through the shoulder of a man, taking careful aim at the huddled women. "This way," Sam called out. "Move toward the kitchen." Isabel finally worked the last knot loose, and the ropes fell away. "Now," she urged, grabbing Ruth's hand. But Ruth pulled back her eyes wild with a desperate plan. "The lamps," she shouted, holding up the small vial of black powder. "I can bring down the whole front wall." "Too dangerous," Callie protested. "We're dead anyway, if we don't try something." Ruth shot back her father's lessons echoing in her mind. A bullet whined past Isabel's head, close enough that she felt its heat. She ducked instinctively, her dancer's reflexes saving her life. "Do it," Joanne commanded with military authority. "I'll cover you." Ruth sprinted toward the oil lamps, hanging along the front wall, clutching the vial of powder. Behind her, Sam laid down covering fire, while the other women moved toward the kitchen. A miner tried to intercept Ruth, but Isabel appeared beside him, like a vengeful spirit, driving her elbow into his solar plexus, with enough force to double him over. Ruth reached the lamps and began pouring the black powder onto the oil, her hands steady despite the chaos. This was demolition work, dangerous, precise, requiring nerves of steel. "Ruth!" Callie screamed as one of Finch's men raised his rifle toward the girl. The shot came from an unexpected direction. Naomi had grabbed a derringer from a fallen miner and put a bullet through the gunman's wrist with surprising accuracy. Ruth finished her work and dove toward the kitchen as the powder-soaked oil ignited. The explosion wasn't massive, but it was enough to blow out the front windows and send burning debris across the saloon floor. In the confusion that followed, the 5 women and Sam fought their way through the kitchen and out into the cool desert night. "Which way?" Isabel gasped, blood trickling from a cut on her cheek. Sam pointed toward a maze of abandoned mine shafts that honeycombed the hills around Red Mesa. "Up there. We can lose them in the tunnels." Behind them, Finch's voice rose above the flames. "Find them, they can't have gone far." As they climbed into the rocky terrain, Ruth looked back at the burning saloon and felt something she had not experienced since her family's death, the satisfaction of striking back at the forces that had tried to destroy her. The real fight was just beginning. The abandoned silver mine, known as Devil's Throat, had been carved into the mountainside by desperate men chasing dreams of wealth that never materialized. Now it served as sanctuary for 5 women and 1 gunfighter who had nowhere else to run. Sam led them through a maze of tunnels lit only by the oil lamp he had grabbed from the saloon, the flame casting dancing shadows on walls that wept moisture and despair. The air was thin and cold, carrying the metallic taste of old fear and broken hopes. "Istulfur, how far back do these go?" Joanne asked, her military training making her think in terms of defensive positions and escape routes. "Miles," Sam replied grimly. "But Finch knows these mines as well as I do. We can't stay here long." Ruth stumbled on the uneven floor, her earlier adrenaline wearing off, to leave her shaking with exhaustion and delayed shock. The explosion at the saloon had worked, but it had also announced their position to every hostile within 5 miles. Isabel caught Ruth's arm, steadying her. "Easy, Chica. You did good back there. My father taught me about explosives," Ruth said quietly. "Before the mine accident. Before they killed him for asking too many questions about safety violations." The revelation hung in the air like smoke. Each woman carried secrets, losses, betrayals that had led them to Finch's stage. Callie tested the tunnel walls with her rancher's knowledge of geology. "These walls are unstable. One loud noise could bring the whole section down." "Then we better keep moving," Sam said. But his voice carried a weight that made the women look at him more closely. Naomi pulled out her charcoal and wrote on the tunnel wall, "You failed before." Sam's jaw tightened. "My mother. When I was 16. Comancheros took her during a raid on our farm. I tracked them for weeks, but..." He trailed off, the memory still raw after 20 years. By the time I found their camp, she was already dead. I've been trying to make up for that failure ever since. Is that why you saved us? Isabel asked softly. Partly. Sam's honesty was brutal in its simplicity. But mostly because letting evil go unpunished makes you complicit in it. They moved deeper into the mine, past rusted equipment and the scattered bones of small animals that had died in the darkness. The tunnel branched in multiple directions, and Sam chose the path that led toward an old ventilation shaft he remembered from his prospecting days. That's when they heard the voices echoing from behind them. They went into Devil's Throat. The voice belonged to Jake Brewster Finch's most trusted lieutenant. Split up and check every tunnel. Shit, Sam muttered. They're moving faster than I hoped. Joanne immediately took charge, her military experience kicking in. We need a defensive position. Somewhere we can control the approaches. There's a wider chamber about 100 yards ahead, Sam said. But if they corner us there, then we make sure they pay a price for it. Ruth interrupted, surprising everyone with a steel in her voice. They reached the chamber as the first torchlights began flickering in the tunnel behind them. The space was roughly circular with 3 passages leading out, and an old mine cart that could provide limited cover. Sam checked his ammunition, 8 bullets left in his gun, maybe 24 more in his belt. Against an unknown number of pursuers in familiar territory, the odds were not encouraging. Listen, he said urgently. There's another way out through the ventilation shaft, but it's a hell of a climb, and only one person can go at a time. We stay together, Isabel said firmly. Isabel's right. Callie agreed. We've come this far as a team. Naomi wrote quickly on the wall, together or not at all. Then we fight, Joanne said, checking the rifle she had taken from the saloon. Military style. Coordinated fields of fire, controlled retreat if necessary. The torchlights were getting closer, and they could hear multiple voices now, at least 6 men, maybe more. Ruth knelt beside the old minecart, examining its construction with her father's trained eye. This cart is full of black powder residue, she said quietly. If I can rig it right. Another explosion, Sam asked. Not here. Too much risk of cave-in. But if we can roll it down that main tunnel. Ruth's plan was taking shape, even as she spoke. The first gunshot echoed through the chamber as Brewster's men reached the entrance. The bullet struck the rock wall inches from Sam's head, sending stone chips flying. Sam returned fire, his shot illuminating the tunnel mouth with muzzle flash. A man screamed, and the torchlight wavered. Now, Ruth shouted, throwing her weight against the minecart. The others joined her, and the heavy cart began rolling toward the main tunnel, picking up speed as it hit the downward slope. Ruth had packed the last of her black powder around the cart's wheels, and when it reached the pursuing men, the explosion lit up the entire tunnel system like the wrath of God. Rock fell from the ceiling, dust billowed in choking clouds, and screams echoed from multiple directions. In the chaos that followed, Sam led the women toward the ventilation shaft. But as they reached the base of the natural chimney that led to the surface, they heard something that chilled their blood. Well, came a cold voice from the shadows. Going somewhere. Marshal Tom Davis stepped into their lamplight, his badge gleaming and his gun drawn. But something was wrong with the picture. His clothes were too fine for a lawman's salary, and his smile held no warmth. Marshal, Sam said carefully. Finch's men are trapped in that tunnel. We need to get these women to safety. These women are wanted for arson and assault. Davis replied smoothly. I'm here to take them back to face justice. Naomi's charcoal moved quickly across the rock. Not real Marshal. Fake badge, Isabel asked quietly. A real badge. Davis corrected, having overheard. But flexible loyalties. Saul Finch pays better than the territorial government. The corrupt lawman's revelation changed everything. If they couldn't trust the badge, they couldn't trust anyone in authority. You have 2 choices, Davis continued. Come back quietly, and maybe you live through this. or resist and I'll bring back your bodies and claim you died trying to escape." Sam's hand moved toward his gun, but Davis was ready for him. "I wouldn't, Crowe. I've got 4 men positioned at the top of this shaft. You're surrounded." Ruth looked up at the ventilation shaft, her demolitions knowledge calculating angles and structural weaknesses. "How much black powder do you have left?" she whispered to Sam. "None," he replied. "I do." Ruth pulled another small vial from inside her shirt, her emergency reserve. "But I'll need a distraction." Isabel understood immediately. "Leave that to us. What happened next would be talked about in Red Mesa for years to come. The night 5 women turned from victims into warriors." Isabel launched herself at Davis with the grace and power of a trained dancer, her movements flowing like deadly water. The corrupt marshal's attention fixed on her as she spun past his guard, giving Ruth the opening she needed to wedge the black powder vial into a crack in the shaft wall. Callie and Joanne moved in perfect coordination, Callie using her ranch-born strength to grapple with Davis, while Joanne applied military combat techniques to disarm him. Naomi, silent but deadly, climbed the shaft wall like a spider reaching the powder charge just as Davis broke free from the other women. "Everybody down," Ruth shouted. The explosion was small, but precisely placed, bringing down a shower of rocks that blocked the ventilation shaft, but also opened a new passage, one that led toward an old mine entrance Ruth had spotted during her calculations. In the dust and confusion, they followed her through the new opening, leaving behind a cursing Davis and the sound of reinforcements arriving. They emerged from the mountainside, just as dawn painted the desert in shades of gold and blood. Red Mesa lay spread below them, its buildings looking small and insignificant in the morning light. "Now what?" Callie asked, exhaustion heavy in her voice. Sam looked at the 5 women who had fought beside him with more courage than many soldiers he had known. They were dirty wounded and exhausted, but their eyes burned with something that had not been there in Finch's Saloon hope. "Now we finish this," he said grimly, "but not by running, by fighting back." "What do you mean?" Isabel asked. "I mean we're going to tear down Finch's whole operation," Sam replied. "Every crooked lawman, every forged contract, every woman they've stolen. We're going to burn it all down." Ruth smiled for the first time since the nightmare began. "I like the sound of that." But none of them realized that their greatest test still lay ahead, and that one of their own carried a secret that would either save them all or destroy everything they had fought for. The abandoned ranch house squatted in the desert, like a sun-bleached skeleton, its adobe walls cracked and its wooden beams warped by years of neglect. But it offered something precious: shelter water from a still-functioning well and high ground that commanded a view of the approaches from all directions. Sam had known about this place for years, had even considered buying it before deciding that solitude suited him better than homesteading. Now, as he watched 5 exhausted women collapse gratefully into the shade of the covered porch, he wondered if isolation had been the wrong choice. "How long can we stay here?" Joanne asked, her military pragmatism cutting through the relief of temporary safety. "Not long," Sam admitted. "Finch will figure out where we've gone. This place is too obvious to anyone who knows the territory." Ruth was already exploring the property with her demolitions expert's eye for structural weaknesses and defensive advantages. "The well is positioned perfectly for a siege," she called out. "And these walls are thick enough to stop rifle bullets, but not thick enough to stop a determined assault." Callie pointed out her rancher's experience with Indian raids, giving her a sobering perspective. Isabel found a cracked mirror inside the house and studied her reflection, dirt-streaked face, torn dress blood under her fingernails from the fight in the mine. But her eyes still blazed with unbroken spirit. "So, we don't wait for them to come to us. We take the fight to them. 5 women and 1 man against an entire town." Naomi wrote on the dusty floor with her ever-present charcoal. "Not the entire town," Sam said thoughtfully. "Just the corrupt part of it, and we wouldn't be fighting alone." He pulled a letter from his shirt pocket, the paper worn from multiple readings. I sent word to the territorial marshal 3 days ago before I ever reached Red Mesa. If he got my message. If, Callie repeated skeptically. That's a big word to hang our lives on. Sam's jaw tightened. It's all we've got. Unless you want to spend the rest of your lives running. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. Through the shimmering heat waves rising from the desert floor, they could see a dust cloud moving steadily toward the ranch. How many? Joanne asked, already moving to a defensive position. Sam squinted through his spyglass. 6. No 8 riders. But something's wrong with this picture. What do you mean? Isabel demanded. They're not riding like hunters, Sam said slowly. They're riding like a military patrol. The lead rider carried something that made Sam's heart race with desperate hope, a federal marshal's star that caught the sunlight like a beacon. But hope was a luxury they couldn't afford. Too much had gone wrong, too many people had betrayed them. Trust was a coin they no longer possessed. Could be another trap, Ruth said quietly. Davis had a real badge too. Then we assume it's a trap until proven otherwise. Joanne decided. Defensive positions ready to fight or run. The riders approached slowly their leader, holding up an empty hand in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. As they drew closer, Sam could make out more details. Dusty uniforms, tired horses, the look of men who had ridden hard and far. Sam Crowe, the lead rider, called out when they were still 50 yards away. I'm Marshal Jake Morris in Territorial Law. I got your message. Sam's relief was tempered by caution. Prove it, he called back. Morrison reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a folded paper. You wrote about Saul Finch's operation. Said you had witnesses to human trafficking, forged documents, and corruption reaching into the territorial government. The details were too specific to be a lucky guess. Either this was the real Marshal Morrison, or Finch's network was even more sophisticated than they had imagined. What took you so long? Sam shouted. Had to gather evidence first, Morrison replied. And I brought someone who insisted on coming along. A second rider moved forward, and Sam's world tilted on its axis. The woman who rode beside Marshal Morrison was older than he remembered, her dark hair streaked with premature gray, her face bearing the marks of suffering endured and overcome. But her eyes, those were the same eyes that had comforted him through childhood nightmares and celebrated his small triumphs. Hello, Samuel, Maria Crowe said quietly. I told you I'd come home someday. For a moment, Sam couldn't speak. His sister dead for 2 years, and his mind mourned and avenged and buried in the deepest chambers of his heart, sat before him alive and whole and impossibly real. Maria, his voice cracked like a teenager's. It's me, Hermano. Older, scarred, but still your annoying little sister. The reunion was interrupted by Ruth's sharp voice. It's a trap. Everyone spun to look at her weapons, half-drawn, trust fracturing like glass. What? Sam demanded. Ruth's face was pale but determined. Not them. Us. We're the trap. Before anyone could ask what she meant, she continued in a rush. I've been working for Finch. Not willingly, he has my younger brother. Said he'd kill Jimmy if I didn't feed him information about any lawmen who got too close to his operation. The silence that followed was deafening. 5 pairs of eyes stared at Ruth with expressions ranging from disbelief to betrayal to cold fury. You led them to us, Isabel said, her voice deadly quiet. No, Ruth protested. I led them away from you. Every piece of information I gave Finch was wrong. I told him you were heading for Mexico, that you had stolen horses from the livery, that Sam was planning to rob the bank. Anything to keep him looking in the wrong direction. But you could have told us, Callie said, hurt evident in her voice. And risk you treating me differently, risk you deciding I was too dangerous to trust. Ruth's composure cracked. I was terrified you'd leave me behind if you knew. Naomi approached Ruth slowly, her charcoal moving across the dusty ground. "You saved us." "She's right," Sam said after a long moment. "If Finch has been chasing false leads, it explains why we've stayed ahead of him this long." But your brother, Joanne, asked her military mind, focusing on tactical concerns. "If Finch realizes you've been feeding him lies." Ruth's face went white. "He'll kill Jimmy." Marshal Morrison had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding. "Miss," he said to Ruth, "what's your brother's last name, and where is Finch holding him?" "Kellerman. Jimmy Kellerman. He's at the mine compound, building explosives for Finch's operation." Ruth's voice broke. "He's only 15. Morrison nodded grimly. "Then we better move fast. Because according to the intelligence we've gathered, Finch is planning something big for tonight. Something that involves enough black powder to level half of Red Mesa." The revelation hit them like a physical blow. Finch wasn't just running a trafficking operation, he was planning some kind of massive destruction. "What kind of operation needs that much explosive?" Sam asked. Maria answered, her voice heavy with hard-won knowledge. "The kind that eliminates witnesses permanently. Finch isn't just corrupt, he's desperate. If he can't control the situation, he'll destroy it entirely, including the women he's holding," Isabel demanded. "Especially the women he's holding," Maria confirmed. "They're evidence of his crimes. Dead witnesses can't testify." Ruth stood abruptly, her young face set with determination that aged her a decade. "Then we have to stop him. Tonight," Callie asked pointedly. "You still don't trust me?" Ruth said quietly, "I understand. But my brother is in there, and so are other women who deserve the same chance at freedom you gave me. I'm going after them whether you come with me or not." Sam looked around at the group his sister returned from the dead, a federal marshal who might represent salvation or another trap. 5 women who had been through hell together, and now this revelation that one of them had been deceiving the others, albeit for the best of reasons. Trust was a fragile thing, easily broken and hard to repair. But sometimes, in the face of absolute evil, it was the only weapon that mattered. "We go together," he decided. "All of us. But this time, no more secrets. Anyone holding anything back speaks now or stays behind." Joanne took a deep breath. "I have something to confess too." The group turned to her with expressions of weary expectation. "During the war, I provided medical aid to a Confederate intelligence officer in exchange for safe passage through enemy territory. He was dying, and I could have let him die and taken his papers. Instead, I saved his life, and he gave me information that helped Union forces capture an entire rebel supply depot." She paused, her military bearing rigid with the weight of old shame. "I never reported the contact. Never told my superiors about the intelligence. I was terrified they'd court-martial me for fraternizing with the enemy, even though it resulted in a major victory." "That's not betrayal," Sam said. "That's pragmatism. Maybe. But it taught me that sometimes survival requires moral compromises. And sometimes those compromises lead to greater good than rigid adherence to rules." Naomi wrote quickly, "We all have scars. We all survived. That makes us stronger." Isabel nodded slowly. "She's right. We've all been broken by this world. But broken things can be reforged into something stronger than the original." Marshal Morrison had been listening with the patience of a man who understood human nature in all its complexity. "Ladies, gentlemen, this is all very touching. But we have a situation that's about to go from bad to catastrophic. If Finch is planning what I think he's planning, we have maybe 6 hours before Red Mesa becomes a crater in the desert." "What exactly do you think he's planning?" Sam asked. "A mining accident," Maria said grimly. "The biggest one in territorial history. He'll claim that stolen explosives caused a massive cave-in that destroyed his compound, killed all the witnesses, and unfortunately resulted in his own heroic death while trying to save them. Except he won't actually be in the explosion, Morrison added. He'll be on a fast horse heading for Mexico with enough money to live like a king for the rest of his life. Ruth's demolitions expertise made her the first to grasp the full horror of the plan. If he sets off that much black powder in the mine system, it won't just destroy the compound. The shock waves will bring down every tunnel in the mountain. The whole settlement could collapse into sinkholes. How many people live in Red Mesa? Callie asked quietly. About 300, Sam replied. The weight of that number settled over them like a burial shroud. 300 innocent lives, plus the unknown number of women being held captive, all about to die to cover up one man's crimes. So we stop him, Isabel said with simple determination. Against how many men? Joanne asked. Morrison consulted his notes. Intelligence suggests Finch has about 20 armed men still loyal to him. Plus, whatever townspeople he can convince that you're the real threat. 20 to 8 odds, Sam calculated. I've faced worse, but not with this much at stake, Ruth pointed out. If we fail, if even one of us makes a mistake, then 300 people die, Naomi wrote starkly. Marshal Morrison stood his decision made. We don't have time for more debate. Finch's timeline is dictated by practical concerns. He needs darkness to position his charges without being observed. And he needs enough time afterward to reach the Mexican border before anyone realizes he's not actually dead. So when Maria asked, "Sunset," Morrison replied grimly, "Maybe a little after." Which gives us about 4 hours to plan and execute a rescue operation against a fortified position defended by men who have nothing left to lose. Sam looked around at his unlikely army, 5 traumatized women, 1 federal marshal, and a sister he had thought dead. It should have been a hopeless situation. Instead, for the first time since entering Finch's palace, he felt like they actually had a chance. Then we better get started, he said. The mine compound clung to the mountainside like a cancerous growth, its collection of shacks, equipment yards, and processing facilities connected by a network of wooden walkways and pulley systems that creaked ominously in the desert wind. Lights flickered in the windows of the main building where Finch conducted his business, and guards patrolled the perimeter with the casual alertness of men who had grown comfortable in their power. From their concealment in the rocks above the compound, Sam studied the layout through his spyglass, while the others planned their approach. The federal marshal had proven to be a man of practical experience. He understood that sometimes the law had to be enforced by those willing to risk everything for justice. The main building houses Finch's office and the holding cells, Morrison whispered, consulting a rough map drawn from Maria's memory. Explosives are stored in the shed near the mine entrance. That's where your brother will be, Miss Kellerman. Ruth nodded tightly, her hands steady despite the fear that gnawed at her gut. She had not seen Jimmy in 3 months, had no idea what condition Finch was keeping him in, or even if he was still alive. How many women are being held? Isabel asked quietly. Unknown, Maria replied. The number changes constantly as they're moved through the network. Could be anywhere from 5 to 20. Processing building is where they forge the documents, Morrison added. If we can secure that and the evidence inside, we can shut down the entire operation permanently, Sam finished. Joanne had been studying the compound with her military eye for defensive positions and weak points. Guard towers at the north and south approaches, but the eastern side is blind. If we can reach that equipment yard, too open. Callie disagreed. They'd spot us before we got halfway across. What if we create a distraction? Ruth suggested, her demolitions mind already working on possibilities. I could rig a small charge on the western side, draw their attention. Too risky, Sam said immediately. One wrong move and you alert the whole compound. Naomi had been silent throughout the planning, but now she tapped her charcoal against the rock and wrote, "Servant entrance." "Back kitchen." Maria leaned forward to read the words. She's right. There's a service door where they bring in supplies. Usually only one guard, and he's more focused on keeping people from stealing food than watching for intruders. That's our way in, Morrison decided. But we need to move fast once we're inside. Finch has probably set his charges on a timer. We might have minutes, not hours. The plan they developed was simple by necessity and desperate by design. Morrison and Sam would take the main building, neutralizing Finch and his lieutenants while securing any evidence. Maria and Joanne would free the captive women and guide them to safety. Ruth and Callie would locate Jimmy and secure the explosives. Isabel and Naomi would watch the approaches and provide covering fire if needed. It was a plan with a dozen ways to go wrong, and only one way to succeed: perfect execution under impossible circumstances. As the sun touched the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold, they made their move. The service entrance was exactly where Maria remembered it, a narrow door set into the compound's back wall beside a pile of empty supply crates. The guard was a young man, barely out of his teens, more interested in the bottle of whiskey he was sipping than the darkening desert around him. Sam approached from his blind side, moving with the silent grace of a natural predator. The guard never knew what hit him. Sam's arm encircled his throat, cutting off his air and consciousness in seconds. They lowered him gently to the ground and bound him with strips torn from his own shirt. Poor kid, Ruth whispered, looking at the unconscious guard's face. Probably doesn't even understand what he's mixed up in. Save your sympathy, Isabel replied harshly. He chose his side when he took Finch's money. They slipped through the door into a narrow corridor that smelled of cooking grease and unwashed bodies. Voices echoed from deeper in the building, men laughing, women weeping, the sound of violence, casual and constant. Morrison and Sam split off toward the main office, while the others moved toward the holding area. The wooden floors creaked under their feet despite their attempts at stealth, and every sound seemed amplified in the tense silence. That's when they heard the scream. It came from somewhere ahead of them, a woman's voice raised in agony and terror. The sound cut through their careful planning like a blade, turning strategy into desperate urgency. Ruth broke into a run toward the sound, her fear for Jimmy overwhelming her caution. The others followed, abandoning stealth for speed as they raced through the maze of corridors. They burst into a large room that had once been a mining office and was now a vision of hell. Chains hung from the ceiling beams, and wooden cages lined the walls like animal pens. In the center of the room, a woman hung suspended by her wrists, while one of Finch's men prepared to strike her with a leather whip. But it was the figure in the corner that made Ruth's heart stop. Jimmy Kellerman sat hunched over a table covered with black powder charges, his 15-year-old face gaunt with malnutrition and marked by recent beatings. His hands shook as he worked, tears streaming down his cheeks as he assembled the devices that would kill innocent people. Ruth started toward him, but the crack of a gunshot froze her in place. Saul Finch emerged from the shadows, like a well-dressed demon, his revolver smoking and his gold teeth gleaming in the lamplight. Well, well. The merchandise returns to its rightful owner. Behind him stood Jake Brewster and 4 other armed men, their weapons trained on the rescue party. The trap had been perfectly laid. They had walked into exactly the situation Finch wanted. "Did you really think I wouldn't figure out your little deception, Miss Kellerman?" Finch's voice was silk wrapped around a blade. "Your brother has been very helpful in explaining your creative communications." Ruth's face went white as she understood. "You made him tell you. I made him understand the consequences of continued lies." Finch corrected. "Children are so much more cooperative when properly motivated." Jimmy looked up at his sister with eyes that held too much pain for his young face. "I'm sorry, Ruth. I tried not to tell him, but he said he'd start cutting off fingers." "It's not your fault," Ruth said fiercely. "None of this is your fault." Finch smiled with genuine pleasure at the family reunion. How touching. Now, since you're all here, you can participate in tonight's grand finale. Quirken star. What grand finale? Maria demanded, stepping forward with the confidence of someone who had faced down worse monsters than Saul Finch. Why the tragic mining accident that will claim so many lives? Finch explained with mock sorrow, including 5 dangerous criminals who died trying to rob my compound, and the heroic lawmen who died trying to stop them. You're insane, Joanne said flatly. I'm practical, Finch corrected. This operation has become too visible, attracted too much attention. Time to close up shop and start fresh somewhere else. But first, I need to eliminate the witnesses. He gestured to Jimmy with casual cruelty. Your brother has been assembling enough explosive charges to bring down this entire mountain. Amazing what a child can accomplish when properly motivated. Ruth's demolitions expertise made her understand immediately. The structural charges in the mine tunnels. You're going to cause a complete collapse. Not a very good. And when the dust settles, the territorial government will find evidence that you and your friends were planning to rob the Red Mesa bank using explosives stolen from my compound. Tragically, your amateur handling of dangerous materials resulted in a catastrophic accident. What about the women in the cages? Isabel demanded, gesturing to the prisoners who watched this exchange with growing horror. Acceptable losses, Finch replied with a shrug. Their contracts will burn in the explosion, and there will be no one left to contradict my version of events. The casual evil of it was breathtaking. Finch was planning to murder dozens of innocent people to cover his crimes, and he spoke about it like discussing the weather. That's when the shooting started. The first shot came from the corridor behind them, Morrison's voice roaring, "Federal Marshal," as his gun barked. Finch's men spun toward the sound, and chaos erupted as the rescue party scattered for cover. Ruth dove toward her brother, bullets whining past her head as she slid across the floor. Jimmy looked up at her approach with desperate hope, and she saw that his hands were not shaking from fear, or they were shaking because he had been working on something other than explosive charges. The timers, he whispered urgently. I reset all the timers. They won't go off for another hour. Ruth's heart swelled with pride for her brilliant little brother. You beautiful genius. But Finch has a manual trigger, Jimmy continued. If he gets to the main charge. A bullet splintered the table beside them, and Ruth threw herself over Jimmy as more shots filled the air. Around the room, her companions fought with the desperation of people who knew this was their last chance. Isabel had found a chain and was using it like a weapon, and the metal links singing through the air to crack against skulls and break bones. Her dancer's grace had become a warrior's deadly precision. Callie and Joanne fought back-to-back the rancher's daughter and the ex-military nurse, covering each other with the practiced efficiency of soldiers. Callie's rifle spoke with steady authority, while Joanne used a captured pistol to devastating effect. Naomi had freed several of the caged women and was leading them toward the exit, her natural leadership shining through the chaos. The silent woman had found her voice at last, shouting orders and encouragement as she shepherded the prisoners to safety. Maria moved through the battle like an avenging angel, years of captivity and suffering transformed into cold fury as she hunted Jake Brewster with single-minded determination. And in the center of it all, Sam Crowe faced Saul Finch in a confrontation that had been building since the moment he walked into that saloon. You should have taken the money and walked away. Finch snarled, his gold teeth gleaming as he raised his gun. Should have. Sam agreed, his own weapon steady in his hand. But then, I wouldn't be able to do this. The two shots came so close together, they sounded like one. Both men staggered, both men bled, but only one remained standing. Saul Finch looked down at the spreading red stain on his vest with genuine surprise. That's inconvenient. He toppled backward, his gun clattering across the floor as his life leaked out onto the rough wooden planks. Sam pressed a hand to his own wound, a graze along his ribs that hurt like hell, but wasn't fatal. Around him, the battle was winding down as Finch's remaining men either surrendered or fled into the desert night. "Is it over?" Ruth asked, still shielding her brother with her body. "Not yet," Morrison said grimly as he entered the room, his badge gleaming and his gun smoking. "We still have to deal with those charges Jimmy mentioned." Ruth helped her brother to his feet, noting with relief that despite his ordeal, Jimmy seemed fundamentally unbroken. "Show us," she said gently. Jimmy led them deeper into the compound to a shaft that descended into the heart of the mountain. Wooden platforms and rope pulleys carried them down into a maze of tunnels where Jimmy had been forced to place explosive charges at key structural points. "There," he said, pointing to a large device attached to the main support beam. "That's the master charge. If it goes off, everything comes down." Ruth studied the mechanism with her father's trained eye. It was sophisticated work, too sophisticated for a 15-year-old boy working under duress. "Who helped you build this?" she asked quietly. Jimmy's face darkened. "Finch brought in a specialist. Said he learned demolition work in the war. Man named Carson." "Where is he now?" Morrison demanded. "Gone," Jimmy replied. "Left yesterday, said his work was done." Ruth continued examining the device, her expertise revealing layers of redundancy and fail-safes that made it nearly impossible to disarm safely. "This isn't just a demolition charge," she said slowly. "It's a trap." "What do you mean?" Sam asked. "I mean it's designed to go off if anyone tries to remove it improperly. Carson didn't just want to destroy the mountain, he wanted to kill anyone who tried to stop the destruction." The implications were chilling. Even with Finch dead and his operation broken, they were still in mortal danger from a device that could kill them all if handled incorrectly. "Can you disarm it?" Morrison asked. Ruth studied the complex mechanism, her father's lessons echoing in her mind. "Maybe. But I'll need time and everyone else needs to be clear of the blast radius." "How much time?" Maria asked. Ruth checked the timer mechanism Jimmy had modified. "We have 43 minutes before the automatic trigger engages. If I can't disarm it by then." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood the consequences. "Then we better get started," Sam said grimly. What followed were the longest 40 minutes of their lives. While Ruth worked on the explosive device with Jimmy assisting the others, evacuated the compound, and began spreading word through Red Mesa that everyone needed to move to higher ground. Most of the townspeople responded to Marshal Morrison's authority, but some refused to believe the danger was real. It took Callie's knowledge of the local families and Isabel's persuasive passion to convince the holdouts that this was not a drill or a false alarm. With 20 minutes left on the timer, Ruth encountered a problem that made her blood run cold. "The trigger mechanism is more complex than I thought," she called up to the others. "Carson built in a secondary system that I can't bypass without risking premature detonation." "What does that mean?" Sam asked, though he already suspected the answer. "It means someone needs to stay behind to manually prevent the detonation. Someone who understands explosives well enough to hold the mechanism steady while the timer runs out." "You," Morrison said immediately. "Me," Ruth agreed. "No." The voice belonged to Jimmy, and it was stronger than anyone had heard from him since his rescue. "I built this thing. I know every circuit, every connection. And I'm smaller, I can reach places you can't." "Absolutely not," Ruth said fiercely. "I'm not leaving you behind. And I'm not letting my sister die for my mistakes," Jimmy replied with quiet determination. The argument that followed was brief, but intense, ended by the cold reality of the timer, ticking down toward zero. In the end, both Kellerman siblings stayed behind, working together, with the perfect coordination of a team that had learned to trust each other completely. 15 minutes, Ruth announced as the others reluctantly prepared to leave. "We'll be back for you," Sam promised. "You better be," Ruth replied with a smile that didn't quite hide her fear. The evacuation reached the safe zone with 8 minutes to spare. From their position on a ridge overlooking the valley, they could see the lights of the compound and the dark mouth of the mine shaft, where two brave young people worked to prevent a catastrophe. 5 minutes, Morrison announced, checking his pocket watch. Through his spyglass, Sam could see Ruth and Jimmy moving around the explosive device with careful precision, their coordination speaking of shared expertise and absolute trust. 3 minutes. Isabel found herself praying in Spanish words her grandmother had taught her for protection against evil and disaster. 2 minutes. Callie gripped Joanne's hand, and the ex-military nurse returned the pressure with her own steady strength. 1 minute. Naomi wrote frantically in the dirt. Come on, come on, come on. 30 seconds. Maria closed her eyes, unable to watch the final moments. 10 seconds. The timer reached 0. Nothing happened. For a long moment, nobody moved or breathed. Then, in the distance, they saw two figures emerge from the mine shaft, moving quickly but steadily toward the evacuation zone. The cheer that went up from the ridge could probably be heard in Santa Fe. Ruth and Jimmy Kellerman had saved Red Mesa, and in doing so, they had saved themselves. 6 months later, the settlement that had grown up around the abandoned ranch house bore little resemblance to the desperate refuge where 7 unlikely allies had first planned their assault on Saul Finch's empire. Haven, as it had come to be known, consisted of a dozen well-built adobe structures arranged around a central courtyard, where children played and women worked at trades that brought dignity along with income. The well that Sam had praised for its defensive value now served a community of 43 residents, all of whom had arrived with stories of loss, betrayal, and survival. Ruth Kellerman had become the settlement's unofficial engineer, using her demolitions expertise to clear irrigation channels and level building sites. Her brother Jimmy worked beside her, his skill with explosives now turned toward construction rather than destruction. The nightmares still came sometimes, but they were growing less frequent as new memories replaced the old. Isabel Valdez had established a school where she taught not only reading and writing, but also music and dance. Her classes drew students from as far away as Santa Fe, and her evening performances had become legendary throughout the territory. The scars on her face had faded, but more importantly, the fire in her eyes now burned with joy rather than rage. Callie Morrison had proven to have an extraordinary gift for breeding horses, and the animals she raised were sought after by ranchers and cavalry officers alike. She had also become the settlement's unofficial diplomat, her straightforward honesty earning the trust of neighboring communities that might otherwise have been suspicious of a town founded by former outcasts. Joanne Bradford had built a medical clinic that served not only Haven, but the surrounding region. Her skills had saved dozens of lives, and her refusal to ask questions about her patients' pasts had made her a folk hero among people who lived outside the law's protection. The territorial government had even offered her an official position, which she had politely declined. Naomi Chen had found her voice again, though she still preferred writing to speaking when the subject was important. Her carefully maintained records had become crucial evidence in federal prosecutions that dismantled trafficking networks throughout the Southwest. More importantly, she had become the settlement's memory keeper, documenting the stories of every woman who passed through their doors. Sam Crowe had discovered that leadership suited him better than solitude. As Haven's unofficial mayor and chief of security, he had developed policies that balanced compassion with practical necessity. The settlement welcomed anyone seeking refuge, but it also maintained the discipline and vigilance necessary to survive in a harsh land among hostile neighbors. Maria Crowe had become a federal agent working with Marshal Morrison to track down the remaining elements of the trafficking network. Her unique perspective as both survivor and investigator made her invaluable in understanding the psychology of both victims and criminals. She visited Haven regularly, and the haunted look had finally left her eyes completely. Marshal Morrison had been promoted to Territorial Chief of Law Enforcement, largely based on his successful dismantling of the Red Mesa trafficking ring. He had also become a frequent visitor to Haven, though whether his interest was purely professional or also personal remained a subject of considerable speculation among the residents. The legal aftermath of their confrontation with Finch had been swift and decisive. The evidence recovered from the compound, combined with testimony from the rescued women and Maria's intelligence work, had resulted in arrests and convictions throughout the territory. The corrupt officials who had enabled the trafficking network found themselves facing federal charges that carried sentences measured in decades rather than years. But perhaps the most significant change was less tangible: the transformation of 5 traumatized women into a community of leaders, healers, and protectors. On this particular evening, as the desert sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the residents of Haven gathered for their weekly community meeting. It was a tradition that had evolved naturally, a time for sharing news, resolving disputes, and planning for the future. The territorial legislature is considering a bill that would provide official recognition and funding for settlements like ours, Ruth announced to the assembled group. Marshal Morrison thinks it has a good chance of passing. What would that mean practically? Asked Elena Vasquez, one of the newer residents who had arrived with her 3 children after escaping an abusive marriage. Legal protection, Joanne explained. Right now we exist in a gray area. Official recognition would give us the same status as any other incorporated town. With the same obligations, Callie added. Taxes, territorial laws, oversight from Santa Fe. Is that good or bad? Asked another resident. The question sparked a debate that reflected the fundamental tension in their community, the desire for security and legitimacy, balanced against the fear of losing the independence that made Haven a sanctuary for people who didn't fit elsewhere. I think, Isabel said finally, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard, that we need to decide what kind of place we want to be. Are we a temporary refuge, or are we building something permanent? It was Naomi who provided the answer, her words written large on the slate board that had become her preferred method of addressing the group. We are home. The simple statement carried profound weight. These women, who had been scattered across the territory by violence and betrayal, had found something in Haven that many of them had never known a place where they belonged, not despite their scars, but because of them. Then we vote, Sam said simply. All in favor of pursuing territorial recognition. The show of hands was unanimous. As the meeting broke up and residents began returning to their homes, Ruth found herself standing alone in the courtyard, looking up at the stars that seemed close enough to touch in the clear desert air. Second thoughts? Sam asked, joining her in the darkness. No, Ruth replied. Just grateful, I guess, for all of it, even the bad parts. Even the bad parts, especially the bad parts, Ruth clarified. They're what brought us together. They're what made us strong enough to build this place. Sam nodded, understanding what she meant. The trauma that had scattered them across the desert had also forged bonds stronger than blood, created a family that chose to stay together rather than being forced together by accident of birth. You know, Ruth said thoughtfully, when I was rigging those explosives to bring down Finch's saloon, I thought I was just trying to create a distraction. But looking back, you were tearing down something rotten to make room for something better. Sam finished. Exactly. They stood in comfortable silence, 2 survivors who had learned that sometimes destruction was necessary for creation, and that sometimes the only way to build something beautiful was to first clear away something ugly. Sam, yeah, thank you for walking through those doors that night, for giving us a chance to save ourselves. Sam's smile was visible even in the starlight. Thank you for being worth saving. In the distance, a coyote howled its voice, carrying across the desert wind. Once that sound had seemed lonely and mournful. Now it sounded like freedom, like wildness, like the untamed spirit that had made their survival possible. The 5 brides who had once been auctioned like cattle had become something their captors could never have imagined, the founders of a community that would stand as a beacon of hope for generations of women who needed proof that broken things could be made whole again. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all. As Ruth walked back toward her house, she passed the small monument they had erected in the center of the courtyard, a simple stone marker bearing the names of all the women who had died in trafficking networks throughout the territory. At the bottom, in letters carved deep into the granite, were the words that had become Haven's unofficial motto. Freedom is not given, it is taken. The stone bore no mention of Saul Finch or his crimes, no commemoration of the battles they had fought or the enemies they had defeated. Instead, it focused on the future, on the promise that no woman who reached their doors would ever face darkness alone again. Ruth touched the stone gently, as she did every night, and whispered a prayer of gratitude for the unlikely family that had saved her and the community they had built from ashes and hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new women seeking refuge, new opportunities to prove that courage could bloom in the darkest places. But tonight, she was home surrounded by people who understood that sometimes the best families were the ones you chose for yourself. The last light faded from the western sky, and the desert settled into its ancient rhythms of night and silence. But in Haven, lights burned warm and steady, marking a place where the lost could find their way and the broken could become whole again. It was exactly what they had fought for, exactly what they had earned through blood and tears and desperate courage. It was enough.